Hello, and welcome back to Err is Human, Why We Keep Screwing Things Up, and What to Do About It. For those of you doing the homework, I hope you enjoyed reading the Abilene Paradox and realized just how much in our own lives we do that every day. What do you want to do? Oh, I'm fine, whatever you want to do. Oh, okay, well, whatever you want to do. That leads to unhappiness. It leads us to places that we really don't want to go because it creates tensions and errors when it shouldn't, when we know what we want to do and we don't do it. All right, so part 6 is on survival, and this is the first act, and this is on focus. So I've given you all sorts of reasons why we're error-prone beings, why we're going to make errors. But I think that we can do better than that. And there's many ways for us to do better. First, we need to know that we are error-prone beings. We create risk, quite unconsciously, that we'll make errors. So we need to know those biases and how to combat them. And I've given you a few examples. There are hundreds of biases and little mind games and tricks that our minds use to be more efficient. You need to be aware of those as well. And as Freud said, sometimes it's good to be honest with yourself. You need to focus on those biases and truly look at yourself and say, do I make those errors? Am I error prone? Are those biases shortcuts that I'm using and using in ways that are going to get me in trouble? Then you also need to know what situations you're likely to get into those troubles. So the whole start of this series here talked about, back in the beginning, I talked about my question around interviewing patients with headaches. I have recognized that as a situation in which I could potentially make an error by applying unconscious biases. And we need to identify those. And now, anytime I walk into a room to interview a patient with a headache, to do my history and physical, I'm always aware of the risk of error. Know System 1 and System 2. Know what they're good at, but also know what they're bad at. And avoid naive cynicism. Just because someone doesn't agree with you doesn't mean that they're not right. We don't have our own sole ownership of what's correct and what's not correct. We need to work in teams. We need to work with essentially our partners in medicine and patient care to make sure that each of us minimizes our risk for error, and collectively we greatly reduce the risk for error. We also need to just pay attention. When we go and we interview a patient, we interrupt them, we redirect them, we don't listen to what they say. The same thing happens in our management decisions and in our leadership decisions. We ask people questions and then we don't pay attention to the answers. And when we don't pay attention to the answers, we end up not having the answer we need because we didn't pay attention, and we're unable to make intelligent decisions, or at least informed decisions. And that's an error. Overconfidence bias is one that most people who end up in leadership have to a certain degree. We are sure that we're good at what we do because of the position we're in. And that may be true, but it may also be true that other factors are the reason why we're in the position we're in. So either be as good as you think you are, which is really hard, or think that you're only as good as you actually are. And that takes a lot of honest self-reflection to be able to say, these are my limitations. I know that I'm not good at the follow-through. I can put things together, but if you want someone who's detail-oriented to track down every last detail, make sure that everything is running the way it should, I'm not the person for that job. Now, I've been in a lot of situations where that's what I've needed to do, and it took a lot of reflection to know that when I get to that point, I need to hand over the work to someone else because that's their area of specialty in project management or project initiation. It's not mine. I'm better at the big ideas and the overall concepts. Now this one, I'm going to give credit to Piers Anthony. The guy has sold enough books. He's got to have figured something out. But we should think about the way that we're thinking about things. So in parallel processing, this is a very strong method of thinking about a problem. We're focusing all of our attention on it, and we are likely to get to the right answer. The problem is that we don't get very far when we do this. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to move just a little distance in terms of our thinking. But we know that where we've moved from and to, we should have the right answer. Sometimes we need intuitive leaps, where we're moving along a track of thinking, and then with no connection at all, we jump to the right answer. And that's also very helpful, but you have a risk of jumping in just about any direction and not necessarily landing where you need to. Sometimes all we do is go round and round and round in circles. And if you get stuck permanently in this, that gets you nowhere. But sometimes to really process something difficult or either emotionally or intellectually difficult, we need to come around and around and around and around again until we find the angle that we haven't seen before, and at that point break out into another mode of thinking. Creative thinking is good. It generates lots of different options. The problem is bringing all of those options together is challenging because they're in lots of different directions. And then finally, linear thinking is very helpful because we can move from one point to another over a reasonable distance and things are logically connected to each other. The problem is that a very little deviation from course at the beginning of moving through a problem can lead to a very wide divergence at the end. You can see how if you moved that line just a little bit, you'd end up in a very different place. So all of these modes of thinking, and there's many others, but all these modes of thinking are a way that we approach problems. And we don't necessarily consciously think about which mode we're using. But if we stopped and analyzed our thought process, we could identify which one it is. And sometimes when we're not moving forward on a problem, when we're not coming to the solution, or when we're making errors, we need to stop and think about how we're thinking about those problems and come up with a different way to think about them. Avoid what you see is all there is. I love this Rumsfeld quote. There are known knowns. Those are the things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And this is absolutely true. The most dangerous person in clinical care is usually the person who doesn't know what they don't know, and more importantly, doesn't recognize the possibility that there might be things that they don't know. And so it's okay that there are things we don't know. That's the nature of the universe. But we have to be willing to accept that there are things that we don't know. And when we get into situations where things aren't aligning quite right, where the answer we're getting doesn't feel correct, that we back out and say, what don't I know that I don't know? And who can I look to find out if there is in fact something I don't know and I need to learn more about? This is System 1's biggest weakness. It looks at a picture and ends the investigation. It doesn't look further to get the much bigger picture, to identify the things it doesn't know. You also need to be able to define your problems. And one of the first problems is no one can actually be sure this quote is attributable to Einstein, although it is in many forms attributed to him. If I only had 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. And sometimes it says only 5 minutes solving the problem through conventional means. So we as humans tend to like to jump to solutions. This is actually a principle of lean management, that we often will come up with a solution before we even know what the problem is. And sometimes it works. That's that intuitive leap. But often our heads are filled with solutions just looking for problems. And when we see a problem, hear about a problem that seems to line up with one of the solutions we have in our head, we immediately put that solution out. And so the whole A3 process is about defining your problem, and then at the end of that time, once you know what the problem is, solving it. Now, I mean, really, the guy is now CEO of the largest healthcare IT creativity company in the world, frankly. He's got to be doing something right here. So if you're not familiar with the Checklist Manifesto, I'm shocked. But if you are, you know how effective a checklist can be in preventing error. Now, here's one really important point about checklists, and this does get missed. A checklist has to be used by an expert. A checklist is a series of memory cues for your highest risk events. You cannot put everything that needs to be done on a checklist, nor can you give a checklist to an amateur and expect them to perform at an expert level. That's not what a checklist does. A checklist is a way of organizing so that as we move through it, we make sure that critical actions are taken, but we still have to fill in the rest. A checklist on how to build a house doesn't drive the first nail. It just tells you the order in which you should do things and what you'll need to be able to accomplish it. Crew resource management is another important tool in safety and error prevention. Everyone working together as a team needs to be aware of what's happening, needs to have situational awareness. Because remember, going back to the beginning, you couldn't see your nose, but anyone else in the room could see your nose without a problem. Sometimes your perspective, physically or mentally, keeps you from seeing a problem, and you need someone else with a different perspective to look at that problem. One of the other important pieces of crew resource management is that everyone's responsible for safety. This is called an OODA loop. This is the product of Colonel Boyd's work when he got tired of watching pilots get shot down because they weren't able to process what was happening in their environment quickly enough, particularly when they were following rigid structured checklists and weren't able to respond appropriately to enemy pilots. So we start by observing what's going on, and then we process it through orientation. And orientation is probably the most important part of an OODA loop. It also, as you look at it, is System 1 and System 2 processing work. And it's where we can get in trouble, but it's also where we can find great solutions. Then we decide, generate a hypothesis, and then we have to act on it. And our actions are essentially hypothesis testing. And there's some implicit guidance and control, things that just are as they are. We always do them. And this is really important in expert care. One of the reasons why good emergency physicians don't get in trouble when they're presented with bizarre presentations is they always do the same thing every time. They follow the same workup for the same chief complaint and then would vary it if need be, but establish that as their baseline. And then you look at how your hypothesis interacts with the environment, how things are going, and you observe again. So this is also an iterative process. You don't end with acting. You then observe the consequences of your action and come back around again through the OODA loop. So, what's your homework? If you haven't read the Checklist Manifesto, read the Checklist Manifesto. And you can very easily come up with at least 3 routine operations in your work that a checklist would make safer or more effective. And then I want you to write those checklists. This is an important thing. Turn your theoretical work into practical work. This is, as an emergency department medical director, one of the things that I do most commonly. I develop checklists and processes that help people do standard work for common tasks, and those checklists make everyone safer. Read the Wikipedia entry on OODA loop, and then read John Boyd's Destruction and Creation, which was one of the foundational pieces for his thinking on this. There's also a 5-slide set called John Boyd's The Essence of Winning and Losing. Look through that slide set, and then once you have gone through both of those and read the Wikipedia entry, I want you to think about this question. Orientation, as I said, is about perspective. Perspective is system 1 and system 2, and so it comes with your biases and heuristics. And so you could look at an OODA loop and look at that orientation piece and say, right there, that kills the whole thing. Unless you're an expert, your orientation is going to create risk of poor hypothesis generation leading to improper actions. That may be true. But then I want you to think about the iterative nature of an OODA loop and the fact that you go back and observe. And how does that iterative nature, how does going back again and again and looking at the outcomes of your decisions mitigate the risk that your biases and heuristics are going to cause error? And then once you've done that, I want you to reflect a little bit further. Morbidity and Mortality Conference is one of the most fundamental defining characteristics of the physician practice of medicine. We hold ourselves up in front of our peers to be torn down. We embrace constructive criticism and sometimes even destructive criticism, although we try to avoid that when we can, of our actions. We learn by seeing how others think. So I want you to think about that iterative nature, the returning to analyze decisions post hoc, and how that, when used to guide and train biases and heuristics, makes them effective tools rather than risk-creating rules. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2, where we'll explore further solutions to how to keep our error-prone selves from creating error.